October 25th, 1944, 417 hours, east of Samar in the Philippine Sea. A humid wind rolled across the flight deck of USS Taffy 3 Elms escort carriers as Admiral Thomas C. Kinkaid stood in the dim glow of the Combat Information Center aboard his flagship, the heavy cruiser USS Louisville. Far to the east, the black horizon rippled with heavy seas, broken only by the faint silhouettes of destroyers shepherding his 7th Fleet's invasion support forces. Radio circuits crackled with routine night reports, fuel states, radar maintenance logs, the readiness status of morning strike groups. Nothing suggested the imminence of disaster. Then, at 0417 hours, a radar operator in Fanshawe Bay's CIC froze. A contact cluster, large, fast-moving, and closing from the northwest, had appeared on the 10-centimeter air search scope. The operator checked again, refined the sweep, and reported the return as surface, many, approximate range, 34,000 yards. The words surface contact made no sense at that distance. No Japanese units should have been within 300 miles of Leyte Gulf. The Imperial Navy's remaining carrier force had been lured north by Admiral Halsey. Kinkaid had been assured that the battered center force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita had already been crippled in the Sibuyan Sea, but the radar echo did not lie. By 0421 hours, additional scopes across Taffy 3 lit up with the unmistakable pattern of a massive surface formation closing at over 25 knots. Phosphorescence from the waves began to glint off steel hulls, long, towering silhouettes rising out of the dark. Kinkaid stared at the first encoded contact reports, feeling his throat tighten as the names came in. Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, Haruna, the core of the Japanese battleship elite, already in gun range of his unarmored escort carriers and screening destroyers. The Imperial Navy had returned through San Bernardino Strait, not crippled, not disorganized, but storming toward the vulnerable American invasion fleet with overwhelming firepower. At 0445 hours, Yamato's first salvo arced into the sky, 18.1-inch shells rising like meteors before plunging down onto the sea near USS White Plains. Towering geysers erupted as Kinkaid gripped the edge of the plotting table. He had expected air battles, submarine attacks, logistical strain, but not this. Not a surface breakthrough aimed directly at the transports, ammunition ships, hospital vessels, and fuel tankers, upon which the entire Leyte operation depended. His escort carriers were launching aircraft as fast as the deck crews could haul them forward. His destroyers were accelerating to flank speed, preparing to interpose themselves suicidally. Kinkaid understood in that moment that the battle ahead would not be a measured carrier duel or a carefully planned strike sequence. It would be a desperate, improvised clash. American escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts against the most powerful battleship a force Japan had ever assembled. And if he failed to stop them, the Japanese would drive straight into the amphibious zone and obliterate the Leyte lodgment. As the first aircraft roared into the pre-dawn sky and the destroyer's boilers strained under emergency power, Kinkaid realized that the carrier clash he was about to fight, small, improvised, and tactically desperate, might decide the fate of the Pacific War itself. Because if Japan broke the American beachhead at Leyte, the liberation of the Philippines would fail. And if the Philippines remained in Japanese hands, the entire American strategy for strangling Japan's empire would unravel. This was the moment when his decisions would seal Japan's fate. Thomas Casson Kinkaid was not the type of admiral who drew attention. Soft-spoken, methodical, and unfailingly calm, he had risen through the U.S. Navy's ranks not by theatrics or bravado, but by competence. Years spent in destroyer commands, staff roles, and technical billets that polished him into a commander who understood both surface warfare and the emerging realities of carrier combat. By 1944, he commanded the 7th Fleet under General Douglas MacArthur's broader Southwest Pacific command structure. His primary role was not to hunt the Imperial Navy, but to support ground operations, escort convoys, land troops, protect supply lines, and coordinate naval gunfire. Kinkaid's fleet was strong but asymmetrical. Heavy cruisers, old battleships, escort carriers, and destroyers designed for amphibious support, not blue water carrier duels. That responsibility shaped the composition of his carrier force. While Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet in the Central Pacific fielded fast fleet carriers like Essex, Lexington, and Intrepid, Kinkaid's fleet relied on escort carriers, slower, smaller ships with air groups optimized for anti-submarine warfare and close air support. These Jeep carriers of Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3 each carried around 28 aircraft. FM-2 Wildcats for air defense and TBM Avengers for bombing and torpedo work. Their maximum speed rarely exceeded 19 knots. They were never intended to confront battleships. Japan understood this imbalance. After months of defeats in the Central Pacific, the Imperial Navy conceived Operation Shogo 1, a desperate, multi-pronged counterattack meant to annihilate the American invasion at Leyte. The plan depended on deception and timing. The northern force under Admiral Ozawa would lure Halsey away with empty carriers, their flight decks nearly devoid of aircraft but still potent as bait, while Kurida's center force, built around the mighty Yamato and Musashi, would push through the Sibuyan Sea and strike the American landing forces from the north or west. Japan's plan also depended on a miracle of operational secrecy. Kurida's flagship Atago was sunk by torpedoes from USS Darter on October 23rd, and Musashi was obliterated by successive waves of American carrier aircraft on the 24th. But the center force did not break. Though damaged and scattered, it turned west, regrouped, then slipped through San Bernardino Strait during the night, precisely when Halsey had raced north with his entire fast carrier force in pursuit of Ozawa's decoy carriers. That decision left the central Philippines astonishingly exposed. Kinkaid, believing Halsey still guarded the northern approaches, assumed his escort carriers only needed to provide air support for the beaches. He was unaware of Kurida's resurgence or Halsey's departure. Faulty communications, ambiguous radio phrasing, and overlapping command structures masked the danger. Throughout October 24th, Taffy 3, under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, operated off the eastern coast of Samar, launching close air support sorties. The seas rolled gently, and the pilots returned reporting minimal enemy activity. Sprague's small task unit, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, Johnston, Howell, Heerman, and 4 destroyer escorts, Samuel B. Roberts, Raymond, Dennis, John C. Butler, maintained routine operations, their defensive posture relaxed. Their aircraft returned with half-spent ammunition loads, having struck scattered Japanese positions on Leyte. None of them anticipated a battle fleet approaching at flank speed through the night. Meanwhile, Kurida's ships thundered eastward at nearly 25 knots. Yamato, Nagato, and their cruiser escorts maintained tight formations, their lookouts scanning for American task forces they assumed must be nearby. But none appeared. Halsey had departed. 7th Fleet's heavier units were guarding the southern approaches. Taffy 3 floated unknowingly directly in the path of the most powerful Japanese surface formation remaining in the war. As the center force neared the eastern exit of the strait, they passed through patches of tropical squalls that masked them from American radar. Kurita maintained radio silence, unwilling to reveal his position. He believed that if he could reach Leyte Gulf by mid-morning, he could wreak havoc among the American transports and supply vessels. Victory could devastate the American foothold in the Philippines and potentially force negotiations that preserved parts of Japan's empire. Kinkaid, meanwhile, spent the evening of October 24th reviewing situation reports that indicated Halsey's 3rd Fleet was engaging the Japanese carriers far to the north. His planners believed the enemy's surface forces had been crippled earlier in the Sibuyan Sea. The overlapping boundaries between 3rd Fleet and 7th Fleet responsibilities meant that information flowed imperfectly. Kinkaid's intelligence staff received no clear warning that Kurita still possessed a battle-ready force. The result was a series of fatal assumptions. Kinkaid assumed Halsey guarded the northern flank. Halsey assumed Kinkaid knew he had abandoned the strait. Kurita assumed both American fleets were still coordinating. In truth, the 7th Fleet's escort carriers, the smallest, slowest, and lightest carriers in the U.S. Navy, sat directly in the sights of a Japanese task force built around the largest battleships ever constructed. In the hours leading to dawn on October 25th, the sea around Samar was quiet. Taffy 3's deck crews fueled aircraft for close air support. The destroyers steamed in loose protective screens, their 5-inch guns ready but hardly prepared for surface combat against battleships. The escort carriers burned aviation fuel at a steady rate, their engines humming monotonously. Nothing indicated they stood at the edge of the most improbable and unequal naval clash of the Pacific War. What emerged from the darkness at 04:17 hours shattered that calm. The radar returns first puzzled the operators. Large, numerous, fast. Sprague's staff attempted to decipher the contacts, initially suspecting friendly forces. But then lookouts aboard White Plains spotted gun flashes on the western horizon. Moments later, the sky lit up with towering splashes from 18.1-inch shells bracketing the escort carriers. It was the opening barrage of the Japanese center force. Kinkaid received the first urgent reports via encoded circuit. The location was impossible. The strength described was unimaginable. But the evidence was incontrovertible. The Imperial Navy had breached the American perimeter. And Kinkaid, miles away aboard Louisville, now had minutes to act. He knew instantly that the only ships available to stop Kurita were the escort carriers and their escorting destroyers. There were no fast battleships nearby, no Iowa-class to interpose, no Essex-class carriers to counterattack. The 7th Fleet had been built for amphibious support, not fleet combat. Yet fate had placed it squarely at the hinge of the Pacific War. Kinkaid radioed Sprague with a short, urgent order: use every means to resist. He did not have to elaborate. Sprague understood. The destroyers would charge. The escort carriers would launch every aircraft they could, even unarmed, into the storm of metal. Every man would fight to delay the Japanese long enough for reinforcements to close. Kinkaid began transmitting emergency messages to the Third Fleet, to MacArthur's HQ, to any friendly command within range. They needed fast battleships. They needed carrier air groups. They needed anything that could interpose itself between the Japanese guns and the American invasion fleet. For now, they had only Taffy 3. Morning light rose over the Philippine Sea as the Japanese battleships fired again. Towering columns of water rained down on the escort carriers, and the destroyers turned toward the enemy at flank speed. Sprague gritted his teeth. Kinkaid did the same aboard Louisville. The battle that formed in these minutes, improvised, ferocious, outmatched, would become one of the most extraordinary in naval history. And as Kinkaid watched the first strike, groups claw into the sky and the first destroyers dash into the teeth of Japanese salvos, he recognized the truth of the moment. The outcome of Leyte, the liberation of the Philippines, and perhaps the entire Pacific War now hinged not on the largest carriers nor the most powerful guns, but on the courage and improvisation of the smallest task unit afloat. The opening salvos of Kurita's center force crashed into the sea around Taffy 3 at 04 Fight 8 hours. Columns of water, some reaching 150 feet, rose in violent succession as Yamato, Kongo, Haruna, and their attending cruisers unleashed a storm of 18.1-inch and 14-inch shells. The escort carriers, built for 19-knot cruising and running at barely two-thirds the speed of a fleet carrier, wobbled through evasive maneuvers meant more for aircraft than for battleship gunfire. Their thin hulls rattled under each concussion. Yet within these narrow steel decks, crews moved with astonishing speed. As Sprague ordered full launch readiness, deck crews sprinted across oil-slick surfaces, manhandled aircraft into position, and pulled chocks free as pilots throttled forward. At 0500 hours, the first FM-2 Wildcat roared down the flight deck of Fanshawe Bay, its wheels leaving the planks just as a salvo exploded off the port bow. Moments later, TBM Avengers rolled forward, many armed only with depth charges or half-loads of .150 caliber ammunition. There had been no time to rearm with torpedoes or armor-piercing bombs, yet every aircraft that could fly, even if unarmed, was valuable. They could scout, harass, distract, and force Japanese gunners to look skyward instead of toward the American ships. Sprague's destroyers received the other half of the impossible task. The three small, lightly armored ships, Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, along with the destroyer escorts, were ordered to screen the carriers at all costs. It meant they would charge battleships whose gun calibers exceeded the displacement of some of the American vessels. Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans of USS Johnston immediately ordered flank speed and turned toward the enemy without waiting for a formal directive. His ship leapt forward, engines screaming, bow cutting fiercely into the rising swell. Kinkaid, aboard Louisville, received the first desperate situation reports at 0510 hours. The Japanese were inside gun range, inside the perimeter. The escort carriers were taking fire. His air groups were unprepared for a surface engagement of this magnitude, and his nearest heavy units were hours away. But Kinkaid reacted with cold clarity. He transmitted emergency messages to the Third Fleet. Fast carriers return at once. Enemy battleships have broken into Leyte Gulf approaches. He then shifted all available combat air patrol, including from more distant escort carrier groups, toward Samar. He knew reinforcements would take time the small ships of Taffy 3 would have to buy with furious sacrifice. By 0525 hours, Johnston closed to within 16,000 yards of the Japanese line. Shells roared overhead, one striking the destroyer's aft end and shredding the deck around the 40mm mount. Shrapnel tore into the bridge. Evans was wounded, blood trickling into his eyes, but he refused medical attention. He barked new range corrections to his gunnery officer. The crew loaded their 5-inch rifles and opened fire on a target no destroyer was ever meant to engage, the heavy cruiser Kumano. Within minutes, Johnston scored multiple hits, smashing the cruiser's bow and forcing it to fall out of formation. American shells, though small, found vulnerable seams. Smoke poured from Kumano as it rolled to a stop. Weaving between geysers, Evans now prepared for a torpedo run. The Johnston carried 10 Mark 15 torpedoes, hardly enough to cripple a task force, but enough to force evasive action. At 0534 hours, he ordered the ship to turn into a head-on attack against the Japanese center. The destroyer launched her torpedoes at 10,000 yards before swinging hard to port and disappearing into a smoke bank. Moments later, columns of water erupted near the battleship Haruna, forcing the giant ship to maneuver sharply. The torpedoes had missed, but the goal was achieved. The Japanese line hesitated and shifted formation, disrupting their firing solutions. During these minutes, the escort carriers continued launching aircraft. Gambier Bay, trailing behind the formation, found herself targeted by multiple Japanese cruisers. At 05:45 hours, shells straddled her repeatedly. Her thin hull quivered with every hit. Sprague ordered smoke, and destroyer escorts scrambled to lay thick white screens that drifted across the waves like rolling walls. Radar returns flickered between visibility and obscurity, giving the carriers a few precious moments to reposition. Kinkaid remained in constant communication with Sprague, but the tactical decisions now rested squarely with the commander at the point of contact. Sprague ordered his carriers to turn eastward, hoping to outrun the battleships long enough for air power to arrive in strength. The carriers' aircraft, now airborne, formed loose strike groups. Some Avengers attacked without ordnance, strafing Japanese ships to distract or damage exposed crew. Others improvised with depth charges dropped at minimum altitude, unlikely to sink a battleship, but capable of jarring gunners and disrupting optics. At 0600 hours, Hull charged into the Japanese formation. She threaded between shell splashes that rose and fell around her, her hull vibrating under near misses. The destroyer fired torpedoes toward the battleships, while soaking up punishment from several cruisers. Within minutes, Hull was hit over a dozen times. Bridge shattered, steering damaged, communications half destroyed. Yet she remained in motion, firing with her remaining 5-inch gun, throwing everything she had into delaying the enemy. She bought minutes. Those minutes mattered. Heermann, the largest destroyer in Taffy 3, attacked next. She drove headlong at Yamato, launching torpedoes that forced the giant battleship, flagship of the entire Japanese Navy, to turn away. The shift in direction caused a fracture in Kurita's formation, splitting battleships from cruisers. A cohesive bombardment became an overlapping mess. Japanese gunners now competed for firing angles, some ships obscuring others, salvos landing on maneuvering points rather than firing solutions. Kinkaid's message logs from these minutes show terse, clipped transmissions. Taffy 3 under heavy attack. Destroyers engaged battleships at close range. Request immediate air support. Enemy turning south. Cannot hold without reinforcements. From 0615 to 700 hours, the battle reached its most chaotic phase. The escort carriers dodged salvos and laid smoke while their aircraft harassed the Japanese formation with relentless small arms fire. Some pilots returned to their decks, refueled, and took off again without rearming. Others ditched their aircraft in the sea after expending ammunition, hoping to lighten the load for their comrades. Gambier Bay came under concentrated fire from the heavy cruisers, Chikuma and Chokai. Salvos ripped into her stern. Her speed dropped to 11 knots, far slower than the carriers ahead. At 0730 hours, she took multiple hits that caused flooding across her engineering spaces. Sprague watched as she foundered, listing to port. She sank at 0830 hours, the only American carrier ever lost to naval gunfire in World War II. Her sacrifice slowed the Japanese advance by 20 minutes. Meanwhile, Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort scarcely half the size of a Japanese cruiser, charged the enemy at flank speed. Her 5-inch guns rattled like machine guns as she fired more than 600 shells in a single hour. She closed to within 5,000 yards of Japanese heavy cruisers and launched her torpedoes before being struck repeatedly. She sank shortly after 0900 hours, but her attack crippled Chokai, which withdrew burning. By mid-morning, Kinkaid finally received confirmation that Halsey's fast carriers had reversed course. Reinforcements were coming, but the Japanese had already lost momentum. Exhausted, confused by smoke and scattered by torpedo attacks, Kurita's center force began to retreat around 0940 hours. The reasons remained debated: fear of air attack, concern over ammunition, misreading of the battle, but the effect was decisive. The Japanese force that should have annihilated 7th Fleet's vulnerable units instead withdrew without delivering a crippling blow. When Kurita turned away, Kinkaid knew the moment's significance. The Japanese had failed to break into Leyte Gulf. The American beachhead remained intact. The supply lines would continue to flow. The liberation of the Philippines could proceed. The Imperial Navy had mustered its greatest remaining surface strike, and failed. Their final throw of the dice had come up empty. The battle off Samar became a testament to the disproportionate power of courage, improvisation, and tactical genius at the smallest scale. Destroyers attacked battleships. Unarmored escort carriers faced salvos meant for cruisers. Pilots flew into storms of anti-aircraft fire without bombs, simply to distract an enemy more powerful than any American admiral had expected to meet that morning. Kinkaid understood the larger truth as he reviewed the shattered remnants of the morning's action. Japan had invested decades of industrial and national effort into building ships like Yamato and Musashi, massive symbols of naval supremacy. Yet their fate had been sealed by the failure of Japan's operational coordination, the weakness of its carrier aviation, and the overwhelming industrial tempo of the United States. Japan could replace neither ships nor trained aviators. America could replace both faster than Japan could destroy them. The last great surface battle of the Imperial Navy had been fought against the smallest carriers in the American fleet, and it had been lost. From that moment onward, Japan no longer possessed the means to alter the Pacific War's trajectory. Its fleet would fight again, but only in retreat, without hope of reversing strategic reality. Courage had saved Lady Gulf. Systems had sealed Japan's fate. Thank you for watching this World War II story. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.